Welcome everyone to our webinar today, A New Lens on Exposure, from Fragmented Findings to Focused Defense. Today, our two amazing speakers, and if you can go to the next slide, please, Ethan, Shai Mendel and Eitan Yelin are going to take you through a journey of walking through not only some really interesting stats around exposure, but really a new way that you can take and address exposure in your day-to-day environments. But before we get to the good stuff, I got to bore you with a little bit of housekeeping. Of course, the webinar is being recorded. We need to repurpose this in loads and loads of places. The recording will be sent to all the registrants and attendees, and it will be available not only on the Nagomi website, but also our YouTube page. If you're not, please follow us, subscribe, and click to our YouTube. It'll also be on LinkedIn as well. You can submit your questions. If by now, I'm sure you guys are all familiar how to submit questions using Zoom's Q&A feature, but if not, it is on the bottom, and you just submit it there, and we will be taking them throughout the session. In some cases, we may decide to keep them to the end, so stay tuned if needed, if your question's not answered, but I promise you we will get to that. Simple housekeeping, only took a minute. So with that, I am going to go shoot over to you, Eitan. So just really talking about exposure management, what it is and why now.
Thanks, Melissa. So before we start out talking about exposure management, I want to start with this incident from 15 years ago, the Heartland Payment Systems breach. This was front page news in January 2009 when over 130 million card records were stolen. The problem wasn't the complex government-grade hack. The attackers got in through a simple SQL injection flaw on an old web app. But why is this incident still relevant today, and why are we talking about it? First, the attackers exploited a weak point in the perimeter using a well-known and remediable exposure. Second, once they had a foothold, they were able to bypass ineffective security controls and compromise the crown jewels. Essentially, the defenses that were in place failed to detect and stop the attackers. Fast forward to today, and what happened to Heartland in 2009 is still happening daily in 2025. Yes, it's true, IT environments are more complex, attack vectors have become more diverse, and malicious actors have new techniques in their arsenal. However, while the security industry has spent 15 years growing and evolving, the fundamental issues still remain. Exploitation of remediable exposures for initial compromise, followed by the bypass of security guardrails due to ineffectively deployed tools and misconfigurations. The consistent exposure management failure is simply this: we are not succeeding with the tools we already own. So looking at this collage of breaches, you have to ask, why are we stuck in the same place? Why, after 15 years and billions spent on all sorts of advanced cybersecurity, do the core exposure failures, like the one at Heartland, still lead the news every month? The way we see it, there are four main interconnected reasons: siloed data, prioritization challenges, lack of focus on misconfigurations, and mobilization challenges. Obviously, none of these are truly new problems. They are the operational and organizational gaps that we have been neglecting for years. The preventative side of the industry evolved to give us more and more advanced tools without addressing these core challenges. This is precisely what exposure management finally comes to address. Let's briefly jump into each one of these four issues before we talk about how they are addressed together by exposure management. First, siloed data. According to Gartner, the average organization works with 60 to 70 security tools. Although we see numbers that are slightly lower, the fact is that data is segmented into silos between tools that don't communicate enough. This leaves security teams trying to manually connect the dots or making decisions without the full context.
Tiny question, Nathan.
Yep.
Regarding so CTEM is obviously not only a visibility data. So because we already have all the tools, right? So CTEM is also an execution problem. That's one of the main focuses of this webinar. What are the biggest execution problems we encounter?
I think it's a combination of two different problems: the prioritization problem, not knowing what to do, and the mobilization challenge, not having processes and tools in place to help operationalize the findings. Now let's move on to the prioritization challenges. Our tools are giving us endless lists of exposures, but they're not doing a good enough job at prioritization. Many tools prioritize using one or two dimensions, but they don't take all of the context into account, such as full asset posture, business context, and threat intel. Therefore, it's not surprising that the majority of security teams report feeling overwhelmed and don't have confidence that they're focusing on the most important problems. Now, how is it that we have so many tools, yet attackers keep bypassing them? We believe that most organizations are focusing too much on vulnerabilities. The reality is that most breaches could have been prevented with tools already in place. A Microsoft report even found that 98% of breaches could have been prevented with basic hygiene and properly configured tooling. So, organizations are buying the best tools, but not realizing their potential.
And me again. I think you just touched a critical point here. What would happen if we had no vulnerabilities?
Honestly, I think that security teams would be a little lost. They spend so much effort now focusing on vulnerabilities that a lot of teams wouldn't even know what to do if there weren't any. Now, let's move on last to the mobilization drag. Security teams are struggling to remediate the exposures that they choose to focus on. In fact, 71% of security teams report that they're failing to improve workflows related to mobilization. We all know that in today's AI era, mobilization workflows need to speed up and improve. We just don't have the luxury to tread in place. Now, before we move on, let's take a second for a quick poll. Which of the four main pain points resonates most with the challenges that you face in your organization? Siloed data and tools, prioritization challenges, optimizing tool deployment, or mobilization workflows? Now, while we give you a chance to vote, Shai, which one is your favorite or the one that resonates most with you?
It's interesting, by the way, to see the results, which I see. For me, actually, it's the non-trivial ones, the ones that is mostly overlooked, which is the optimizing tool deployment and configuration.
So I'm going to view it from a product point of view and say that my favorite one, and this comes from a nerdy product point, is the prioritization challenges. I think it's really exciting to take all the different contexts together and turn that into a strong prioritization.
Okay, I think people stop voting. Thank you, everyone. I'll do my best. Okay. I hope you can see the results.
I'm not sure if people
Yeah.
could see it, so you want to say?
Yeah, so far, 44% are equal on siloed data and tools and prioritization challenges, and a bit more than 10% on optimizing tool deployment. Sorry, Ethan, you were closer.
Huh. Okay. So let's continue now. Regardless of whichever pain point you chose, we have to acknowledge that all four of these operational failures are interconnected, even if nobody selected mobilization in our survey. This is where exposure management comes in. Exposure management tackles these four failures in a unified manner. So let's look at how the solution maps to the problems. First of all, to fight siloed data, the first step is to unify data, bringing together all of an asset's exposure and context into one data lake. To address the challenge of attackers bypassing the security guardrails, we shift the focus to asset hardening. To overcome endless lists and lack of prioritization, a heavy focus is made on prioritizing the findings. And finally, to eliminate mobilization drag, exposure management places an emphasis on a variety of mobilization tools. So exposure management brings together these capabilities under one umbrella. So now let's talk about Nagomi's perspective. First, as you know, the concepts of CTEM and exposure management are dominating the conversation. Try to walk across the exhibition floor at any major conference and you will not be able to avoid them. The reality is that while a lot of vendors are selling exposure management solutions, some are trying to reposition existing products by rebranding and bolting on new features. For example, forcing a traditional vulnerability management tool into a shiny new exposure management box. At Nagomi, we saw this evolution coming, which is why we recently launched our exposure lens. Before we jump into the demo, we want to spend a couple of minutes sharing the Nagomi perspective on exposure management. But first, we need to clarify a fundamental concept. What exactly is an exposure? It's important to start by saying that an exposure is not only a vulnerability. In the past, security focused narrowly on CVEs. However, that narrow view is what fails us because attackers aren't just exploiting CVEs. They are more frequently taking advantage of misconfigurations. An exposure is the full set of risks, gaps, and weaknesses that an attacker could leverage to compromise your environment. This includes vulnerabilities, but it also includes misconfigurations, coverage gaps, identity entitlement issues, unsecured credentials, and so on.
So I'm very proud to introduce Nagomi's exposure lens. So as Eitan said, we need actually a new paradigm to actually solve the problem of the holistic problem of exposures. In order to do that, we need to start first with understanding the threat side, the threat intel. We need to stay ahead of adversaries to understand exactly their techniques, the tactics, the procedures, etc., that are relevant to your organization. Once we understand that, we overlay it with the vulnerabilities. Of course, the ones that you have in the organizations, regardless of where they come from, but especially highlighting of those that are actually utilized by those threats. Once we understand those two, we overlay all of that with the controls information. This is one of Nagomi's secret sauces. It's about making sure that your defenses actually work. It's about measuring coverage, misconfigurations, effectiveness, and compensating controls across the entire attack surface. By saying all of the attack surface, it's endpoints, servers, identities, you name it, and to correlate everything on each and every asset while understanding its ownership, criticality, and business impact.
Now, at Nagomi, we see the challenge of exposure management a little bit different than other vendors because of our foundation. Our unique perspective starts with our existing solutions, CASM and ASCA. Our CASM solution is the key to solving the crisis of siloed data. We ingest and normalize data from your entire security stack, giving you the unified single source of truth and enabling us to see the full picture and prioritize exposures. Our ASCA solution performs a deep continuous analysis of your security tools and surfaces misconfigurations and coverage gaps. This enables you to plug the holes before the breach happens and significantly improve the resilience of your organization. It is on top of this strong base that we built the rest of our exposure lens. Because we solved the siloed data and misconfiguration problems first, we're positioned perfectly to tackle the most complex challenges. With Exposure Lens, we can accurately prioritize exposures and provide you with an actionable list of the highest impact findings, and we can help facilitate remediation workflows to reduce the remediation lag. Looking at this another way, exposure management is the natural layer added on top of our existing base. So the bottom line is that Nagomi Exposure Lens helps organizations evolve from reactive patching to proactive risk reduction. Now I'm going to pass the share over to Shai for a brief demo.
I don't promise about brief, but we'll have a demo. Okay. Ethan, you can see my screen, right?
Yep.
Amazing. So welcome to Nagomi. As Ethan mentioned, in general, our purpose is to eliminate exposures in the most effective way while making sure your tools, your existing tools, they're actually maximized to prevent breaches to begin with. So Nagomi is a read-only APIs-based solution, which makes it very easy to use and to install. We connect to various solutions in your stack. You can see a bunch of here. By the way, this is a real customer's environment that was completely anonymized. You can see us connecting to different EDRs, identity solutions, email security solutions, security and awareness training, and a bunch of others. While connecting to those tools via read-only API solution, API keys, we actually create the exposure lens. The exposure lens is not a regular asset inventory, as mentioned before. Let's pick an example of an asset, in this case, a device. When we look through the lens, you can easily understand which tools are actually covering that asset, and also explicitly mentioning which tools are supposed to be installed on that asset, but maybe they're not, which creates a risk, one type of an exposure. Second is to understand which vulnerabilities that are non-exploitable vulnerabilities exist on each asset. And of course, the defensive capabilities. This is Nagomi's secret sauce that is the glue between the rest of exposures, which is how effective your existing capabilities on each asset. We actually create an automatic way to assess effectiveness of controls. Everything you see here is Nagomi's controls assessment that is also mapped to MITRE, to NIST, to CIS, and others, which is actually correlated down to the level of each asset and checks what is the actual configuration of each tool and each asset. And we do the assessment, of course, across tools. So even if you have a critical capability provided by two tools, Nagomi will automatically assess for you if each asset is covered by at least one. Given this lens, Nagomi provides multiple classical value props like asset inventory of all sorts, like vulnerability prioritization, like dynamic reporting. But I would want to surface the interesting use cases where Nagomi helps you focus. CTEM and exposure management can be a lot, but we actually believe in surfacing the most critical issues. How does it look like? First, a classical example is to actually track coverage and tool deployments, which was one of your key pain points, according to the poll, automatically with Nagomi. As a user, as a customer, you can actually define which attack surface is supposed to be covered by which tool. Maybe Defender covers only the workstations and the Sentinel-1, the servers, etc. With Nagomi continuously assessing the drifts of the coverage per tool, automatically understanding what is the gap, what is the drift, and of course, automatically creating a ticket and mobilizing it to the teams. This can also be done based on business unit reporting, which we know from our existing customer base that is very, very valuable. Once we have the coverage gap and the rest of the capabilities that we mentioned before, I do want to show you why do we need the exposure lens, how focus comes into reality. One aspect is understanding, given a threat that is relevant to you, what can you do to actually prevent it? What is your posture, your status against that campaign? I'm not sure how many of you in the audience were asked by a colleague, by the CEO, by whoever that is, like, hey, I heard about this campaign in the news. What's our status? What can we do? This is one use case of laser-focused CTEM by Nagomi. We automatically consume threat intel, either your threat intel or the one we provide, automatically understand which ones are relevant to you in your industry, these customers in the manufacturing industry, automatically assess what is your posture on the MITRE attack language. But the interesting piece, what is the concrete action items you can do from an attack, comes into two flavors. One is not automatically understanding which vulnerabilities are being utilized by this active campaign, active attacker. This is an example of a few articles of that attacker. But also which one of those vulnerabilities exists in your environment. And in some cases, maybe you have some assets that not only have this critical vulnerability on them, but they also lack critical controls on them. This is an example of a critical control, which is a missing EDR, which relates to, I assume, two main pain points according to your poll, which is vulnerability management, but also tool deployment. When these two comes together, you have no way but using some sort of a lens to correlate those two together. Another output is, what can I do, given the tool stack I already have, to prevent that attack to begin with? This relies on Nagomi's ASCA unique engine. And in this example, you can see easily, what can I do in Cortex? It actually highlights, you should turn on this capability on Cortex on those failed policies that impact those failed assets. Now, this context helps you, according to what we see, to mobilize this internally. It's not only about surfacing misconfigurations. It's about surfacing the key misconfigurations with the context of why is it relevant to us because of the campaign, in that case, that it's targeting us. What is the concrete policies that I need to fix, and very concretely, how to do it. The last example of focus in CTEM is our new exposure management module. This is not a regular classical exposure management model. It relies on our vulnerability management capabilities. But this is the first time that we actually highlight, as an industry, key proactive detection rules of some sort. We combine exposures according to what we define exposures, highlighting toxic combinations of misconfigurations, vulnerabilities, and coverage gaps together to highlight to your teams what should they focus now. Let's take an example here. So this organization, as you see, has tens of thousands of of assets, but out of them, only 41 assets both have a critical CVE that is a kernel exploitation vulnerability, but those assets also have some key misconfigurations on the tool stack that you already have that could mitigate that detection rule, this actually exploit, right? So Nagomi is here to combine all of those different exposures together through our lens to help you highlight the key things you need to focus on today, and always to mobilize it to your different teams, whether it's your vulnerability teams, your security ops, or security engineering teams. All in all, actually it was relatively short. I hope you got the gist of how Nagomi not only enables the baseline of CTEM, which is asset inventory, configuration assessment, vulnerability prioritization, dynamic dashboards that I haven't showed just because of time, but takes it to the next level of actually helps you focus your defenses where it matters.
Thanks, Shai. And the video is not popping up. We do actually have a few questions in the Q&A. The first question is, what proves that Nagomi's findings, client's current tools working or not, are true? So how are we validating our findings?
Eitan, should I take it and you can expand?
Sure.
Yes. So in terms of industry standards, there are two types of exposure validation. One is active validation. This is classical, like actually sending packets in your network that create lots of noise. These are types of tools that I personally appreciate, because actually all of the people in this conversation from our side actually built some of them in the past, but they're relatively hard to maintain, etc. But there's also passive validation. This is what Nagomi excels in. It's about taking all of the different data points to make sure to actually validate that the exposure is real. Things like whether or not it's actually internet facing, according to your tools. We actually make sure the tool is not deployed, right? We make sure based on the actual configurations, like your actual policies, your actual settings in each and every tool, on each and every asset, that it's actually true. I hope it answered the question, but everything is data-driven, real-time, and correlated together to make sure it's validated.
Yeah, I'll expand on that. There was actually a customer that I spoke to, I think it was a couple of weeks, maybe 2 weeks ago or so, who said that they had an exposure that they had been working with one of our integration sources, and they had already remediated one of the problems. I think in that case it was the CVE. So they had already remediated the CVE and closed out the ticket. And then our exposure management actually showed, our new module showed that exposure had not been fixed. And because it still showed up by us, they went back and checked again. And they saw that even though they had pushed out one of the patches, it hadn't actually solved the solution. So this is a case of a ticket that they had, using another tool, they had kind of closed out the case, but it was still actually not resolved.
We got more questions. Oh, just said thanks. And how quickly mobilization is carried on? So I guess maybe Vikas, if you can elaborate on that, I think that would be really good. Or do you guys feel comfortable with that?
So if you want to elaborate on it to help us fine-tune our answer, but I would say that the mobilization really depends on what is happening in your organization and how the organization works. And we try to connect as naturally as possible to the processes that you have in your organization, whether that's opening tickets or kind of sending different findings and including the remediation data to the relevant teams. So that's kind of the main direction of how we do it.
Yeah, I can elaborate a bit. Sorry.
No, keep going.
In terms of, so obviously mobilization, it really depends on internal and existing processes of the organization. But what we saw is that, and what we were asked by customers in order to expedite mobilization is two things. One is to provide evidence on like the actually as was asked here about the validity of the exposure that we do with the passive validation of each and every exposure, but also to provide as much context as possible, because everyone has lots of things to do. But once you provide the entire context, the threat, the configuration, the vulnerability, like the entire context of why it's important to you, we actually see mobilization drastically improves. Mobilization drastically improves, but it depends on the organization.
Yeah, we're all used to hearing like, I have these exposures. The teams aren't actually, my team opened a ticket for another team. They don't actually do it. To them, it's not prioritized. It's not a metric that they're measured on. So what we try and do is bring together the different exposure data together with the asset context to give the security teams the kind of the ammunition that they need when working with your peer teams to explain to them and convey why something's actually important.
Awesome. Another question is, I noticed there's a new dashboard view showing critical, high, medium, and low categories. Is that part of the Nagomi control I've been hearing about? I saw a little demo at an event, can't remember which, but it looked like a box style grid layout.
It's a good question. I'm happy you found us both on the events and the demos and everything. I assume, and I'll stop sharing in a second, but I assume you were talking about this view here. So yes, and so as we all know, prioritization is an issue, right? So it's not only that we surface the most critical exposure by cross-correlating and creating those toxic combinations. This is already reduces 95% of actual exposures, but we add then another layer of actually prioritizing those anyway critical exposures for you. So I assume that's the grid layout that you talked about. It's indeed all relevant, relatively new, and happy you saw it on the event.
Yeah, and that's just kind of designed to highlight and kind of emphasize different findings, and then you use that and then play with the findings underneath.
And so I think we have time for one more question. I think we have a couple. You see that one that looks good. How would I know that I'm actually reducing my exposure? That was one that I see that came in.
So what we do is we continuously monitor and continuously calculate the exposures. And so like that case that I had mentioned earlier, after we identify the exposure, we'll present it on our platform. And when it's remediated, we'll then stop presenting that. So we do that continuous validation and we're always checking.
Another mechanism that I didn't have time to show, I'll show it if it's okay in 10 seconds.
Yeah, you're fine.
There's a lot to show, so why not?
Sure.
One of the things we didn't focus on is our dynamic dashboarding capability. This was created exactly for that use case. So it's not only tracking like tactical solutions, but it's also in the high level to actually measure the performance of your security operations. The uniqueness of this dashboard, like it's obviously, it has all the classical drag and drop capabilities and changing colors and selecting different business groups on each metric and being able to export and much more. But it also contains unique types of metrics, things like program scores, things like threat. This is the program scores, things like threat effectiveness scores. And you also can use Nagomi's exposure lens to create really like simple to create, but conceptually complicated queries about toxic combinations of some sorts.
Awesome.
So this should help you track to understand how effective you are.
No, this is great. And I know we're up on time, but don't kill me because I didn't tell you I was going to do this. But what is just one final thought that each of you have as we kind of say goodbye to our audience? Just about
So So I'll just start. I'm really excited about what we've already launched right now and the next phases of what we're working on. We're working on some really exciting new additions and new features that are going to connect with this. And there's a lot of exciting parts coming.
That was my answer, so I'll have another one now. I think what excites me, given the poll results, is that I really love to see that it is aligned with the way we see exposure management. So vulnerability prioritization is critical. It's a key building block, but it's not enough. So indeed, silo data and tools, optimizing tool deployments, etc. It's the most important piece to solve exposure management, and I'm really excited to see the alignment from you all.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time today and for everybody who's joining. We will send you a copy of the recording after. And again, Shai and Itan, thank you so much for joining us today. So see you soon.
Thank you, Melissa.
Thanks,
Thank you, everyone.
Take care. Bye.